Hey, so welcome to the finalist voting for the Maven Environmental Challenge. The challenge objective this time around, as you can see here, let me just read it down here. For context, so in 2020, Apple announced that their corporate operations were officially carbon neutral, and they pledged to also make their products carbon neutral by 2030. So to achieve this goal, they set their emissions for 2015 as the baseline. There's a baseline, sorry, and their aim was to reduce them by 75% by 2030, and then the rest of the 25% of remaining emissions they were going to offset with carbon offsets. So that would bring their net emissions to zero. So for the Maven Environmental Challenge, the task for the entrants was to act as an independent journalist and a database enthusiast, and then to use the data provided by Apple in their progress reports to visualize their progress towards becoming carbon neutral in 2030. So are they going to meet their goals or are they not? Now, if we take a sneak peek at the data set here, you'll notice that we've got a few tables. So one is just their emissions broken down by year, category, type, scope, and description. We've got their carbon footprint for their baseline iPhone models for the same time period. And then we've just got a few normalizing factors to kind of help put everything into context. So you can browse some of the challenge submissions here. If you're not seeing yours here, then just make sure to go into your project and select the Maven Environmental Challenge in the checklist as you edit. But with that said, we've got 5 finalists that we're going to talk about, but I'm just going to start by calling out some honorable mentions. So first up, we've got Ebru Badal, and they really leaned into the journalist persona, I think, and they made their report into a sort of newspaper article. And they included a great visual that I do think that shows how Apple can progress towards meeting their goal in 2030 and how they're already on that trend, at least for the gross emissions, maybe not so much for the carbon offsets, which I think will be a common theme as we continue. Then we've got Daksh Taran, who had a similar newspaper approach, and I think they had some nice insights here when breaking out the emissions by scope. I'll wait a second for that to reload. For breaking down the emissions by scope, especially calling out some insights into some of these kind of spiking post-COVID. After that, we've got Yasmin Smander, who again played, I think, the journalist role very well, but from a different perspective. And in this time, it was about challenging Apple's apparent progress through things like their strategic selection of the baseline year to help, make their numbers appear a little bit better. Then after that, we've got Maxim Demyanenko, who really just made a concise dashboard that starts with a general trend and then adds a different perspective into the scopes, the emissions by scope, and then the carbon footprint for the different products. And finally, we have Sairag, who just made a really creative use of his Power BI dashboard and almost making it feel like you're using a real iPad while also calling out some of these really nice insights. So those are the honorable mentions for the Maven Environmental Challenge. Now let's dig into the 5 finalists, starting with Cornelius Oko.
Yeah, so thank you, Cornelius, for preparing another really great project submission and giving me the opportunity to provide a bit of a talk through here for it. Something that jumped out to me right away is in the About section, where there's this decision to provide us with a working operational definition for the key terms that Enrique just talked about that are coming from the project prompt. So we see one I've highlighted here for carbon neutrality, and the other one really quickly provided net zero. So to me, this is a particularly savvy addition here in the About section because as analysts, we often find ourselves in the position of standardizing things. And whether it's giving definitions for what's included or what's not included, or simply defining how we're going to calculate something, providing clear operational definitions like this is a key part of establishing a common language. And in my experience, it really helps with data literacy, creating transparency and trust with our end users. So a really great supportive setup here, and in particular because we're working with information that is a bit technical and nuanced. And we see this commitment to building awareness actually translate through to the final dashboard product itself. Organizing the dashboard into 3 primary sections. In the first one, looking to evaluate that initial announcement and seeing if corporate operations are actually carbon neutral in 2020. And what is astutely identified here is that if we're actually using the net emissions calculation, we don't see it happening until 2021 and 2022. So really good insight there. I also want to draw attention to this middle section here, because this is where Cornelius is dedicating a lot of space to informing the viewer on what it would take for the stated approach to get to those net zero emissions by 2030 would look like when we're visualizing it. So a really effective use here of annotations. So we see this first one, the annotation that talks about the baseline and having it set based on the 2015 data. And then an annotation for number 2 that shows how much that 75% reduction would look like. And then finally, clearly identifying that we need to counter that with an offset in order to get to a net zero. So really great way to set us up as viewers for when we dive into the next section, where Cornelius is going to tackle the question of feasibility of achieving this. And again, great use of layout here, where it's split into 2 separate subsections to help us kind of digest 2 parts of the calculation. On the left, what we see is a predictive analysis of how the emissions may continue to decline based on the historical information that was provided. And what I really appreciate here is there's a clear target line that allows us to assess quite easily whether the intended target could be met or even when it might be met. So that's really helpful for the viewer. On the right-hand side, we see a very similar approach, looking now at the carbon offset portion of the equation. But this is where I think a small tweak could actually really help the viewer. And that's by mirroring what's happening on the left to what's happening on the right. It's not until we actually dive into the text here that we understand that the predictive analysis identifies that there's a bit of a gap in 2030. And I think, Enrique, you already mentioned that this might be a common theme that we see. But it's a little bit hard to tell that from these visuals, first of all, because we don't have a target line included here, but also with them being side by side, we're not immediately aware that the y-axis are different. And so we're looking at 2 different scales. So it actually appears like the bar for offsets is bigger in 2030 than it is for emissions in the same year. So a really small tweak here that could kind of prevent the viewer from quickly scanning these visuals and coming to the wrong conclusion. But overall, really great work here, Cornelius, and a really great example for all of us to learn from.
Okay, next up, we are going to talk about Gabrielle, and that's another already familiar name in these finalist talks. I won't go through the about section too much, but I would invite everybody to read it. It's another well-designed, well-distributed section where he breaks down his intent, his approach, everything down to the color theme that he chose, why he chose it, etc. But let's just jump into the visual itself. And in my opinion, Gabrielle may be among the folks who most directly answered the challenge prompt, if you recollect. So the challenge prompt was to visualize Apple's progress towards their goal, and that's what this is all about. So this is one huge visual packed with information and not really much beside it. We do have a breakdown of Apple most used, let's say, products, but in his own words, even that may be superfluous here. Before I jump into the chart, though, I would like to call out this small piece of education here at the upper right-hand side, which is where he defines what the CO2 equivalent is. So the topic itself is a little bit nuanced. It's all around us, right? So everybody is aware of the ecology and then fighting for against the global warming and stuff like that. But if you dig into it, it's really technical, right? And there are teams of people tackling this stuff. So having this sort of just an introduction into what we are dealing with here. So everybody knows about carbon dioxide, right? But there are other gases that affect the atmosphere, and so he defines this CO2 equivalent as a measure that we're actually looking at in his chart, right? So let's dig into the chart. what do we have here? First of all, I like the fact that it's a bar chart. It could have easily been a line chart, which is a typical choice for a time series analysis. But I like the fact that it's a bar chart because I think it's easily one of the most common types of charts. And as I said, while the topic is all around us, the people who are consuming it may not be as technical. So having a familiar visual really helps here. I think it's a smart choice. The chart itself is split into two sections. So we have on the left, we have the real data, the actual data, right? The emissions as they've been since 2015 until 2022, and then it becomes a projection, right? The projection seems to be a straightforward one, a linear one, where Apple has to lose roughly 2 million tons gross yearly to meet their goal. And he actually distributes, so from the data you could easily understand or maybe conclude that Apple plans to like shrink their emissions until they meet 75% of 2015, and then those 9 point something million tons, they would just offset all of it in 1 year, which, okay, may be possible, maybe not. I'm not a technical person, but Gabrielle here actually splits this over a period of time. And so we see what would need to happen for every year for this goal to be actually zero in 2030. Couple of things that I would mention here in sort of like a feedback. This net here, right? That's potentially a little bit confusing, right? Because if you look at the numbers in the left hand side, on the left hand side, the numbers at the top are actually larger than the gross numbers here, which makes sense because these are actually total. So these are emissions that are from the manufacturing and corporate emissions from their offices and stuff like that, right? So once those stop, which Apple said they did in 2020, and the carbon offsets kick in, then the numbers here actually make sense. These are the net values, and they are smaller than the gross values here. Mathematically, it adds up. I just think that this net gross division here could be potentially confusing. Also, I think it would be a really good idea if these carbon offsets were just differently shaded compared to the rest of the chart, because they're actually a different category, right? This is the emission, and this is what we are doing to offset that emission. I'm nitpicking a little bit here. I think it would be a great addition, but overall, it's really a great work from Gabrielle. Before I move on, I do want to touch on one thing that Gabrielle mentioned in his About Us section. There is a note here. This is not related to his work, but I want to use this opportunity because he says that he uses free version of Power BI Desktop, and he does not have the access to publish the report online. So obviously, he may have built some interactivity into the whole thing. Maybe not, I don't know. But I would like to actually call out the fact that our users can now actually access Power BI service. Until very recently, we have a new service. The limitation here, for those of you who don't know, is that Microsoft is requiring a work or a school email to have any kind of access to Power BI service, even a free one, right? And so now, if you have an account with Maven Analytics, you can actually get a custom email, which is considered a work email, and this will allow you to create a Power BI account. Once you do, you will get a 60-day free trial of Microsoft's Pro Power BI account. But even when that expires, it is still possible to retain your free account and publish your work publicly. This is actually everything that is enough to publish, for example, for Maven Analytics challenges, to publish your work in Maven's showcase, build your portfolio there. Everything works, all with free account from Maven and a free account from Microsoft.
So I'm really happy to be walking through Liliana's challenge submission today. I think she put together a really clever and obviously very well thought out project that really addresses that challenge objective of visualizing Apple's progress towards becoming carbon neutral in 2030. Quickly starting with her project description, I think she did a really great job with laying out her thought process. So rather than kind of reading through all of this, I wanted to kind of point out a couple of examples that really stand out to me. She mentioned right off the bat that she chose to present this in a non-technical article, as she wanted to kind of stay away from the technical aspect and focus more on that message of that she wanted to convey with her visuals. So again, I think that really speaks to that challenge prompt. She also mentioned that she wanted to use the CO2e emissions per $1 million in revenue because it kind of puts a little bit of perspective around that number and what that means. So again, really trying to talk to a layperson and how, giving a layperson a better understanding of what that means exactly. And finally, the other thing that I thought she did really, really well was she discussed the reason that she chose certain visuals. I thought this was a really good call, especially because you'll see here that she mentions that she used a bubble chart in a matrix format. And that's not something that I really see too often, and I don't necessarily see it being done incredibly well. So I thought that being able to understand her reasoning here was really helpful. And then the last thing that she kind of mentioned about her visuals is that she really wanted to convey the visual appeal and the message, and she didn't want to focus so much on the correctness of the visual. I think that this, while it may go against best practices, I think that her reasoning makes a lot of sense here and really ties together that whole idea of making sure that people who don't have the technical and analytical background can still kind of understand what she's talking about. So really diving into her visuals, I think she accomplished her objective of focusing on that message rather than the technical pieces. With setting up her visualization in the style of this kind of magazine article, it kind of makes it clear how you're supposed to navigate throughout the page. So, you're starting at the top, reading down the page, and then moving on to the next page. I really, I want to mention here that one of the things that I like is that despite this being presented as a non-technical article, the text that she has on the screen doesn't necessarily outweigh or overshadow the visualization. So she's still really focused on that point that we want to get across. Generally, I think her visuals are really clean. They're super interesting. And I like that her use of color is really consistent. If we're looking at this bar chart about the total net carbon footprint, I think it's really easy to interpret. And you can see exactly where her prediction is that Apple will earn their first carbon-free $1 million in revenue, right around that 2025, 2026 area. I will say, too, that even though she kind of discussed why she might use that bubble chart, I was prepared to kind of think that it was not the right choice. But with the way she presented it, I really liked this kind of use of visualization. I think that with these reference circles, you'll see around each of the final numbers in 2022, she's comparing the 2015 number or the 2015 size of the bubble to 2022 size. It's a really, really great way for a common person who doesn't have that background to kind of see not only the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per category, but also that percent and size of improvement over time. So, looking at the product transport, for instance, even though we're seeing that it's up 46%, if you look at the size of the original bubble, it's minuscule in the grand scheme of things. So I thought it was a really interesting way to kind of present that information. The last visual that I really wanted to mention here was the iPhone carbon neutral evolution. She obviously, again, Liliana put so much thought into this, and she mentioned in her about section specifically that she chose this visual, like the circular visual, to represent Apple's stated commitment to building products that are circular in design. So I thought that was a really, really clever play on Apple's mission. And, I think that we've seen in a couple of past challenge entries that people sort of focused on the overall storage capacity versus just the carbon footprint. And so I like that Liliana really compared a couple of different metrics from the 2017 iPhone X to 2022's iPhone 14. So we're looking at it not only in terms of carbon footprint and baseline storage, but also those, certified recycled materials, features to enhance durability, and repairable elements, and kind of seeing that even outside of decreasing carbon footprint and increasing baseline storage, Apple is also making changes in other ways. So I think overall, Liliana did a really, really great job with this challenge. The more I looked at this visualization, the more I liked it, and the more I took in and continued to learn. So I think that really by focusing on the messaging, the way that she spoke about, she really embraced that challenge prompt, and she's really kind of visualizing exactly what we asked, which was how is Apple doing with becoming carbon neutral and she's doing it in a way that any person could understand. So this was a super awesome challenge entry, and I'm so glad that I was able to kind of dig into it more deeply.
All right, today I'm going to go over Gerard's submission, and I just want to start by saying I really love this submission. It has two qualities that I love in any data management project. One is a story, and then two is simplicity. So just to start, let's go through the About This Project section. One thing I loved just to start was this bold statement right here. This tells me, as somebody who's not as familiar with this project, exactly what the goal is, which is to visualize the progress towards carbon neutrality in 2030. And then as you scroll down, it's really well explained. And I also like that within the style section, he says that his goal is to be explanatory rather than exploratory. So the idea here isn't for this visualization to be explored, but rather along the way, he tells us what we should be thinking. And then he goes into looking at things from a high level to low level. And there are some details down here that I'm going to come back to after I go through the visual. Okay, so here's the visualization. And if I try to scroll up and down, you'll see this is the whole visualization, which some people might think this is not enough information, but I think it's the perfect amount. So I'm going to zoom in so we can go through it. Okay, so from the top, we get an overview of everything. I love for this section, he talks about like, what does this unit actually mean? And then when you read it, you're like, wow, this is a really big number here. It's not just 38.4. And then he goes into what the goal is. And I like how the main visualization is the goal of the project, which is just to see Apple's progress over the years. And I love this projection here all the way to 2030. And then you see that the actual reductions are this line here. And then that the reductions are outpacing the average year-over-year target, which seems like a good thing, right? And then you see these actual offsets that aren't as high, but compared to this one here, just looking at the range of things, like it seems like Apple's doing great. And then on the right here, you see that they're doing great in terms of these reductions, and they're also still growing as a company. So the story here from this visualization is Apple's doing great. But then I love how the story turns, because then you go down here and you see, are they actually doing that great? Because then when he breaks down the categories by manufacturing, product use, and product transportation, then you see that most of the reduction has been from manufacturing, and that's really clearly seen here. And then for the other categories, like for transportation, that's actually increased. And I think it's really easy to see that here with the color coordination, with the range of the bars. It's just super clear. And then in terms of the future, you see that they have more progress to be made, and it's going to have to be mainly made through manufacturing, which if they've already done all the easy wins through manufacturing, like can they continue to go down their metrics? And I like this last sentence in Gerard's summary, which is basically, this is a hard thing. You're going to have to figure out a way to reduce transportation and product use emissions, or maybe raise the quota for the offsets. So I like how this really simple visualization, it has this really actionable ending to it as well. So overall, I love the story of like, here's the progress, but is it actually good? And then also there's the action at the end. And overall, it's just beautiful. So nice job, Gerard.
All right. So for the last finalist here, we have George. And there's been a lot of excitement in the previous one, so I'm going to have to try to match all of that. I really do like this entry a lot. I am going to start with the About This Project section as well. You'll notice that it's a lot shorter than some of the others that we're used to and some of the other finalists in this list. But I think for me, it achieves what it sets out to. It outlines its approach. George is mentioning that beyond the data set that we provided, he also looked at Apple's environmental progress reports, and he does it for these reasons, which I'll come back to in a second. And then he's got his 3 key insights, right, which I think are very clearly well written and thought out. So one, and as we've seen, most of the emissions are coming from their products, almost 99%. They are on track towards reducing their gross emissions by 75%. But again, as we've seen, the carbon removals are being added at a slower pace that is required to get that 25% to offset by 2030. And finally, with the context of how the business is doing versus how they're reducing their emissions, 46% down with emissions, good. 68% up in revenue in the same time frame, even better. So Now, if we actually take a look at the report, this is where I just want to say that you can tell that he took a look at Apple's reports, A, because of the design language that is clearly very Apple here, and B, in just the way that the goals are outlined. And in the challenge prompt, I think we mentioned that this happened. We mentioned that this is our total goal, but Apple themselves kind of outlined these three goals, and they use this kind of same iconography here as where, goal one, to become carbon neutral for their corporate operations, is complete, and the other two are kind of in progress as we move towards 2030. Now, the visualizations are all his own. I mean, this is all his own, but he didn't borrow from the reports. And you'll notice that this one, a lot of people use the column chart with, column going up meant emission, column going down from the baseline meant removals. I've grown to like this, I think maybe even more with the kind of waterfall style, because the removals, you can see them remove from the actual emissions a lot more clearly. And it gives you also the net emissions very clearly as well. And you can see for the corporate operations exactly when they dipped below that zero, or when they reached that neutrality. So I really came to appreciate this visual. From there, when we start to talk about, the 99% of the emissions coming from the product life cycles, you can see that very clearly here. Yes, it's great that they reached zero with the corporate emissions, but really that was nothing compared to everything else that's going on. Mostly, like we've seen in all the others, coming from manufacturing, product transportation, and product use. So for the product lifecycle emissions, now we see these slope charts similar to Gerard's, where we're seeing most of them drop. Manufacturing was more than halved. But again, we've got product transportation, another common theme that is increasing, at least from 2015 to 2022. So that was with goal 3. I also really like this chart here. I think it pays off its title really well. Environmental progress can be good for business. We've got revenue going up. At the same time, we've got emissions going down. And then I like the added context of saying that the 2023 Apple Watch was the first fully carbon neutral product from Apple. That wasn't included in the data set. We just included the baseline iPhones. But I think it kind of shines a light on, yes, there's still work to be done here, especially if you've shown that you can, put out a carbon neutral product. I think it's only like 1 or 2 iterations of the Apple Watch, but still. I really like this report. I think what's missing for me here, if I had to be critical, is that it does a great job in outlining Apple's progress from 2015 to 2022. It doesn't really mention 2022 towards 2030 beyond mentioning the fact that that's what we're going towards. I know you didn't have the forecast or anything like that, but that's the part that's missing from me here, especially when it comes to the actual challenge prompt, which was visualizing the progress towards 2030. And I think they kind of stopped at where we are now and stopped looking forward. But that's my piece. I still really like this entry, and I think it's going to be a very hard vote. So let me go back to our main page. And before we move on to the selection process, again, I kind of mentioned it as I was talking about George's, but I want to recap the challenge prompt and the criteria. So the prompt: visualize Apple's progress toward meeting the 2030 goal of reaching carbon neutrality across their corporate operations and their product life cycle. And we're not just judging based on the finalized visual or dashboard, let's call it. We're doing the complete project, so every element on the product or of the project page plays a part, about this section, even the title itself, all that good stuff. So having said that, does anyone have any strong initial preferences about an entry that wasn't the one that they talked about themselves? I'll challenge you to that.
Okay, I'll answer your challenge immediately. Stacy totally sold me on Cornelius. I mean, I was pretty pumped about his work to begin with, but after her expose, I'm even more impressed. She definitely caught some of the things that I missed originally. So I think Cornelius definitely should be considered moving forward. I really like the critical sort of approach where he calls out, there's no other word for it, so he calls out Apple and their 2020 carbon neutrality and what carbon neutral actually means against the net zero. Granted, they do respect the criteria, but I love the fact that he pointed out that being carbon neutral doesn't really mean that you are clean completely in your business. So starting just with that, I was bought, and then Stacy added all of the good stuff about the charts and everything. So I'm definitely big on Cornelius here.
Right. Who else?
I'll say I really liked Gabrielle's visualization. I like that main visual that's kind of front and center, and how it clearly shows like current versus projections, and then the top and the bottom charts. That I feel like when things are scaled correctly, it just really gives me a good feel for how the data is actually acting. So also like that top part with the if you scroll up, yeah, with the explanation of the terminology that we may not be familiar with. So I really like this submission.
Yeah, and if I can jump in, I think we have Gerard's example too that we should consider. In particular, Alice, when you really defined how we get this high level initial look at, yeah, we're good and on track. That's an important like check mark to move through, but really asking how sustainable some of those things are. Gerard answered that next piece, which is going into what will it look like in the next 10, 20 years. And I liked when you called out that if we had some easy wins at the beginning, does this particularly look at a sustainable plan over time? So I think that really made me understand how deep the analysis was from Gerard, because those are factors that can kind of be lost when we're just looking at trend lines.
Lauren, any thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of think that, I keep going back to that challenge prompt or the idea that you're an independent, journalist, you're working and a data viz enthusiast. And I think that Gabrielle's really did a good job with kind of like not only tying together a lot of great analysis, but also kind of being that independent journalist. This kind of feels more like an infographic or like a something that you might see in a newspaper rather than just a dashboard. So I think that this is a really, really great entry. And I think that it does kind of give us a lot of information that that kind of tells us exactly how Apple is doing. So I think that this was a really strong entry for me.
Yeah, my 2 cents might be, again, I love all of these. I think from that journalist perspective, which I appreciate, I think even though maybe this is missing like the journalist visual to it, I think like it shows in all of these pieces that the research from the journalist perspective is there. And then the data viz enthusiast in him and in me, like I just learned so much from just watching his charts, I think, which is super impressive. I know it's funny because I know Chris Dutton, in one of his, I think in his charts courses, he has like visualizing progress towards a goal, and he does something like this, but I hadn't seen it since. And having these two targets that kind of meet in these like areas was just like a little bit mind blowing for me. I'm definitely going to copy this. I think he does a great use of these arrows as well. And then the slope chart overlaid with the actual real trend behind it was another great one that I've never seen anyone else do. I'm sure he may have gotten it from somewhere, but I just really appreciate that. So yeah, this is tough. It looks like we've kind of just spoken about the three. I don't know if anyone else wants to mention Liliana's and George's, which were also, I think, stellar, but maybe we.
Yeah, it's tough. We have really great entries that do a lot of common things very well, but then each one shines in its own way. I also want to give huge props to Gerard. I mean, we are all sort of used to his technical prowess, so seeing stuff like this may not be may not be surprising, but it's still really great. As you said, these charts are just so well done that I'm just now at the shaded part, and how for example on the top side we see the Apple outpacing, so this big huge shaded part, but then also at the bottom we see the shaded part where the offsets are hugely underpacing what they should be, considering the target. And so these nuances are really great, and regardless of how proficient somebody is, it's always great to see imagination like this. I do also want to push Gabrielle a little bit more, because what I failed to mention and I really liked is that he actually explicitly calls out the fact which you can see basically almost all of these charts, but he explicitly calls it in the text below the chart that Apple has to start their offsets in a big way right now. Because as of today, everything that we have about carbon offsets is basically just a promise, right? So we are going to offset 9 point something million tons of CO2 equivalent by that year. But if you look at the data that is behind us, the carbon offsets are really negligible. So he's very explicit about, yeah, okay, right. But if there's something going to happen, it has to happen now, and it has to happen big time, right? He mentioned somewhere there's like 12 or 13% just year over year jump in carbon offsets if we're even going to talk about meeting the goals. So there is that piece that I probably should have mentioned in my original exposure, but still something that caught my eye.
All right. Any other thoughts? Anyone still on the fence? You want to just vote straight up on these three? Everyone's ready. We'll vote. So Cornelius will be 1, Gabrielle 2, Gerard 3. Are we ready? All right, 1, 2, 3. And Gerard takes it 4-1. That was, I mean, I think it was a lot closer than the results suggested, but I think very well deserved, Gerard. Let me share my screen again just so we can take a look at this project one more time. Congratulations. This makes you, let's give him a round of applause, I guess, first. I think this makes him officially the only person to ever win 3 challenges on our site. So congratulations, Gerard. Extremely well deserved. I think this is some of your best work yet, which is unsurprising. So as a prize, you'll be taking home a free annual membership to give away since you already got lifetime access as a Hall of Famer. But you'll also be getting a custom Maven Challenge winner t-shirt, which will be the first one that you officially receive. So now you have your crowning trophy there. So congratulations. But that's it for this challenge. Thanks again to everyone that continues to participate. As always, we'll continue to have put these out. We've got another one coming up very soon. So please stay tuned and we're looking forward to it.